Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what Iran did in response to Trump's blockade announcement is not what anyone expected, and it reveals a level of strategic sophistication that should terrify anyone who thought this confrontation would follow predictable patterns. Trump declared a naval blockade of Iranian oil exports. Iran did not respond by threatening to close the Strait of Hormuz. Iran did not respond with missile tests or military exercises. Iran responded by announcing that it is nationalizing all American corporate assets that were seized when sanctions were imposed, auctioning those assets to Chinese and Russian buyers, and using the proceeds to fund a new cryptocurrency specifically designed to circumvent dollar-based sanctions. I am looking at the official decree published by Iran's Supreme Council of Economic Coordination. It lists 17 major American companies whose Iranian subsidiaries, assets, and intellectual property are being seized. The total value, according to Iranian estimates, is approximately $47 billion. Boeing components and aircraft, General Electric turbines and power plant equipment, Caterpillar heavy machinery, Ford and General Motors vehicles and parts. All of it is being nationalized, valued, and sold to the highest bidder with payment accepted in yuan, rubles, gold, or Iran's new digital currency. In the next 20 minutes, I will walk you through exactly what Iran's countermove accomplishes strategically, why it checkmates Trump's blockade before a single ship is stopped, why this represents a fundamental challenge to dollar dominance that goes far beyond Iran, and why American corporate leaders are privately furious at an administration that provoked a response that will cost them billions. This is economic warfare at a level that has not been seen since World War II, and the implications will reshape global finance. Let's start with Trump's blockade announcement and why it was always going to fail before it began. 3 days ago, Trump announced that the United States would enforce a complete naval blockade of Iranian oil exports. Any tanker carrying Iranian oil would be stopped, its cargo confiscated, and the vessel impounded. The stated goal was to reduce Iranian oil revenue to zero and force capitulation on nuclear and regional issues. On its face, this sounds decisive. In reality, it is legally questionable, operationally difficult, and strategically counterproductive. A naval blockade is an act of war under international law. Unless the United States is formally at war with Iran, which it is not, stopping and seizing civilian vessels in international waters is piracy. China, Russia, and European countries all immediately condemned the blockade as illegal and stated they would not recognize American seizures of their flagged vessels. Operationally, enforcing a blockade requires the ability to track and intercept every vessel that might be carrying Iranian oil. Iran exports approximately 1 million barrels per day, mostly to China. That oil is loaded onto tankers that turn off their tracking transponders, transfer cargo between ships in open water, falsify documentation about origin, and deliver to ports that do not cooperate with American authorities. The US Navy would need to physically board and search hundreds of tankers per month to enforce the blockade effectively. That would require resources the Navy does not have and would create constant risk of confrontation with Chinese or Russian naval forces escorting their own commercial vessels. According to naval analysts quoted by Jane's Defense Weekly, enforcing a comprehensive blockade would require committing a substantial portion of the US surface fleet to the Persian Gulf and surrounding waters indefinitely. That would leave other regions underprotected and would strain naval resources to the breaking point. Moreover, every boarded vessel, every confrontation with Chinese escorts, every incident where things go wrong creates risk of escalation that could spiral into broader conflict. Subscribe if you are beginning to understand that Trump's blockade was a political gesture that cannot actually be implemented without triggering worse consequences than it prevents. Now let's talk about why Iran's response is absolutely brilliant. Announcement number 1. By nationalizing American corporate assets and selling them to China and Russia, Iran just turned American companies into hostages of Trump's policy and created a domestic constituency that will demand the policy be reversed. The companies whose assets are being seized are not Trump's political allies. Boeing, General Electric, Caterpillar, these are major American corporations with thousands of employees, billions in market capitalization, and significant political influence. When Iran seizes their assets and auctions them to Chinese competitors, those companies lose not just the current value of the assets, but future access to the Iranian market and the ability to compete against Chinese companies that now own their technology and intellectual property. Boeing is particularly exposed. Iran had ordered 80 commercial aircraft worth approximately $16 billion before sanctions were reimposed. Those aircraft were never delivered. But Boeing has significant maintenance infrastructure, spare parts inventory, and technical data in Iran related to its existing fleet. If that gets sold to a Chinese aircraft manufacturer, China gains access to Boeing's proprietary technology, and Iran's future aircraft purchases will go to Chinese suppliers instead of Boeing. According to analysis from corporate lawyers quoted in the Wall Street Journal, the companies have no legal recourse. Iran is a sovereign nation. It can nationalize foreign assets within its territory. American courts have no jurisdiction. International arbitration requires both parties to accept the process, and Iran has already stated it will not participate in any US-dominated dispute resolution mechanism. Stay with me, because this is where economic policy and corporate interests collide, and corporate interests usually win. These companies are going to pressure the Trump administration to reverse the blockade policy. They are going to lobby Congress. They are going to make campaign contributions to politicians who oppose confrontation with Iran. They are going to use every tool of corporate influence to protect their bottom line. And their message will be simple: your blockade cost us billions, helped our Chinese competitors, and achieved nothing. End it. This is the same dynamic that eventually undermined sanctions on Cuba. American agricultural companies wanted access to Cuban markets. They lobbied for exemptions, then for loosening of sanctions, then for normalization. Economic interests eventually overcame ideological positions. Iran is betting the same thing happens here, and they are probably right. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2. Iran's cryptocurrency initiative is a direct attack on dollar dominance in international transactions, and if it succeeds, it creates a blueprint for every other sanctioned country to follow. The cryptocurrency that Iran is launching is not a speculative investment token. It is designed as a payment system for international trade that bypasses the dollar-dominated banking system entirely. Transactions will be settled on a blockchain jointly operated by Iran, Russia, China, and potentially other countries seeking alternatives to dollar hegemony. The currency will be backed by a basket of commodities including oil, gold, and rare earth metals, giving it intrinsic value independent of any national currency. Here is why this matters. The United States can impose sanctions because the global financial system runs on dollars and clears through American banks. If you want to buy Iranian oil but Iran is sanctioned, you cannot pay in dollars because American banks will freeze the transaction. So trade with Iran becomes extremely difficult, even for countries that do not support sanctions. But if Iran can be paid in a cryptocurrency that does not touch the American banking system, sanctions become unenforceable. A Chinese company can buy Iranian oil, pay in Iran's digital currency, and settle the transaction on a blockchain that no American bank can block. The transaction happens entirely outside the dollar system. According to reporting by Reuters based on leaked planning documents, Iran has been developing this system with technical assistance from Russia and China for over 2 years. The decision to launch it now is a direct response to Trump's escalation. And it is not just about Iran. Russia is already exploring integrating its own digital currency with Iran's system. Venezuela, North Korea, Syria, any country that faces American sanctions has an incentive to adopt this alternative payment system. If enough trade volume shifts to cryptocurrency systems that bypass dollars, it undermines the fundamental mechanism through which American sanctions work. It also reduces global demand for dollars, which could weaken the dollar's value and increase the cost of American government borrowing. This is a long-term strategic threat to American financial power that goes far beyond the specific issue of Iran. One former Treasury Department official, speaking to Financial Times on condition of anonymity, described Iran's cryptocurrency initiative as the most significant challenge to dollar hegemony since the creation of the euro. The official noted that if sanctioned countries can transact outside the dollar system, it removes the leverage that has been the foundation of American foreign policy for decades. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this is what changes the entire strategic calculation. Iran just demonstrated that economic warfare is a two-way street and that America is more vulnerable than it thinks. For decades, the United States has used economic sanctions as a primary tool of foreign policy because sanctions impose costs on targets while appearing less aggressive than military action. But sanctions only work when the target is more economically vulnerable than the sanctioning country. Iran has just proven that calculation is not as one-sided as American policymakers assumed. American companies operating in Iran had $47 billion in assets at risk. Those assets are now being seized. American corporations will lose market share to Chinese competitors. American workers will lose jobs when companies downsize due to losses. American investors will see portfolio values decline when major corporations announce multi-billion-dollar write-offs. Meanwhile, what is Iran losing? Iran already could not access most international markets due to existing sanctions. Iranian companies already could not do business with American firms. The new sanctions and the blockade announcement made Iran's situation worse, but only marginally. Iran was already operating under maximum pressure. Additional pressure does not significantly change their calculus. Think carefully about what this asymmetry means. Trump imposed costs on Iran, but Iran imposed costs back on the United States. And because Iran has already adapted to sanctions, while American companies were just starting to feel the impact, Iran's countermove hurt more than Trump's initial action. This is the same miscalculation that led to failures in Iraq and Afghanistan. American policymakers assumed that because the US military was vastly superior, it could impose its will at acceptable cost. What they discovered was that the enemy got a vote, and asymmetric responses could impose costs that outweighed the benefits of conventional military superiority. Economic warfare follows the same logic. The United States has the stronger economy, but that does not mean it can impose economic pain without receiving pain in return. And in a contest of pain tolerance, authoritarian governments that can suppress domestic discontent often outlast democracies where public pressure forces policy changes. Now let's address what establishment media refuses to discuss honestly, which is that this entire crisis is self-inflicted and serves no American strategic interest. The Iran nuclear deal was working. International inspectors verified that Iran was complying with limits on its nuclear program. The deal was not perfect, but it prevented Iran from developing nuclear weapons while keeping diplomatic channels open. Trump withdrew from the deal because of political opposition to anything associated with the Obama administration, not because of any evidence that Iran was violating terms. After withdrawing, Trump imposed maximum pressure sanctions designed to force Iran to negotiate a better deal. Instead of negotiating, Iran resumed nuclear activities that had been frozen under the original agreement. Iran increased enrichment levels, installed advanced centrifuges, reduced inspector access. The policy designed to prevent Iranian nuclear development accelerated it. Now, having failed to force Iran to capitulate through sanctions, Trump announced a blockade that cannot be effectively enforced and provoked Iranian countermeasures that hurt American companies. At every decision point, the chosen policy made the situation worse, and the people who made those choices will face no consequences for failure. According to polling data from Gallup and Pew Research, a majority of Americans oppose military intervention in the Middle East and want diplomatic solutions to regional conflicts. But American foreign policy is not made by majority opinion. It is made by a combination of ideological commitments, lobbying by interest groups, and domestic political calculations that prioritize partisan advantage over strategic outcomes. This pattern appears throughout history. Great powers enter conflicts or pursue policies that serve no strategic interest, continue those policies despite clear evidence of failure, and only change course after damage becomes so severe that continuation is impossible. The British Empire's handling of Indian independence, Soviet intervention in Afghanistan, American invasion of Iraq. In each case, early warning signs were ignored, critics were dismissed, and policies continued long past the point where failure was obvious. So where does this leave us? 3 scenarios, and the choice between them depends entirely on whether Trump is capable of recognizing failure and changing course. Path 1. Trump quietly backs down from the blockade, claims it achieved its purpose of sending a message, and shifts to different tactics. Iran declares victory, American companies negotiate compensation for seized assets, and the crisis de-escalates. This requires Trump to admit policy failure, which his personality may not allow. Probability 30%. Path 2. Trump doubles down, attempts to enforce the blockade despite operational difficulties, and triggers a series of confrontations with Chinese vessels escorting tankers. No one wants full-scale war, but the risk of accidental escalation increases dramatically. Meanwhile, Iran's cryptocurrency gains adoption, and American companies continue losing market share. Probability 50%. Path 3. The blockade attempt triggers an Iranian closure of the Strait of Hormuz in retaliation. Oil prices spike. Global recession begins. Trump is forced to either start a war he cannot win or back down after immense economic damage. This is the disaster scenario. Probability 20% but increasing. I believe we are currently on path 2, with high risk of sliding into path 3 if Iran concludes that Trump will not back down and that escalation is the only way to force a change in US policy. Here are the questions you need to ask. First, how much economic damage are you personally willing to accept to maintain a policy that is not working and cannot achieve its stated objectives? Second, do you trust that political leaders making these decisions understand the consequences, or are they operating on assumptions disconnected from reality? Third, at what point does failure become so obvious that even the most committed hawks have to admit the policy needs to change? Tell me in the comments whether you think Trump will back down or double down. Tell me whether you believe Iran's countermoves are sustainable or just temporary provocations. We will keep monitoring this situation as it develops. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with anyone who needs to understand that economic warfare is not consequence-free, that adversaries can fight back, and that escalation spirals can produce outcomes far worse than the original problem being addressed. Turn on notifications because this story is evolving rapidly and the next development could change everything. We will see you in the next update.